"There's no seat left. You can sit over there." I froze with a plate in my hands, the heat of the turkey seeping through the porcelain. Someone laughed. Someone lifted a glass. The gravy boat made its slow circle around the table like nothing had happened. And for me there was no chair. Thanksgiving. My family. My home. I stood there, smiling the way women my age are trained to smile, as if I'd arrived too early or too late, as if this were a small misunderstanding that would correct itself. But it didn't. No one moved. No one noticed. I was suddenly aware of the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of forks, the smell of sage and butter settling into my sweater. In that moment, I understood something with a clarity that took my breath away. They hadn't just hurt my feelings. They had erased me. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear my full story, subscribe to the channel. Because this isn't just about a holiday dinner. It's about how a mother was treated like a stranger at her own family's Thanksgiving table. My name is Mary Collins, and I am 71 years old. I have lived long enough to recognize patterns long before anyone admits they exist. Long enough to know when something is being taken away slowly, carefully, so no one can point to the exact moment it disappeared. That Thanksgiving did not come out of nowhere. It was the final page of a story that had been quietly written over many years. All my life, I was the woman who held things together without ceremony. I did not announce my sacrifices or keep mental lists of what I had given. I believed love worked best when it moved quietly, when it didn't demand recognition. I was raised to think that strong women absorb discomfort so others could feel at ease, and I carried that belief with me into every stage of my life. I married young and stayed married for 46 years. I ran a household where problems were handled before they became loud. Bills were paid on time. Meals appeared like clockwork. Children were listened to even when the answers were inconvenient. I learned early that if I stayed calm, people leaned toward me instead of away. Calm became my language. Reliability became my identity. When Nathan was growing up, I was the constant in his life. I was there when he was sick, when he failed, when he succeeded. I didn't hover, but I didn't disappear. I taught him, mostly by example, that love was something you showed through consistency, not speeches. I believed he understood that. I believed he carried it with him. Nathan grew into a man who looked responsible from the outside. He learned how to sound attentive even when his mind was elsewhere. He learned how to agree without fully engaging. When he married Lauren, I told myself I was lucky. She was efficient, confident, organized in ways I had never needed to be. She liked structure. She liked rules that came disguised as preferences. At first, I admired her certainty. Lauren valued order. She valued control that presented itself as helpfulness. She planned far ahead and disliked disruption. I assumed we would find our rhythm. I assumed there would be space for both of us, just arranged differently. They built a beautiful life together. A home with neutral colors and matching dishes. Everything intentional. Everything curated. Conversations that moved quickly and didn't linger too long on anything uncomfortable. It was a life that did not leave much room for pauses, for history, for the slow pace of someone who remembered too much. I did not notice at first when I became one of those inconveniences. It happened gradually. My visits became shorter. My suggestions were acknowledged but rarely used. Plans were made without checking my availability. If I hesitated, the schedule moved on without me. No one was cruel. That was the most confusing part. Everything was done politely, efficiently, with smiles that made it hard to object. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. Families change shape. Independence was healthy. I reminded myself that dignity meant not clinging too tightly. So I didn't. I stepped back willingly, believing there would still be a place for me when I needed it. What I did not understand then was that stepping back is only noble when someone leaves room for you to return. In their world, space once cleared was quickly filled. Still I stayed. I loved them. I believed love had a memory. I believed family remembered who had been there from the beginning. I would learn, slowly and painfully, that memory fades when convenience replaces gratitude. After my husband passed away, I believed family was all I had left. Not in a dramatic or desperate way, not the kind that clings or begs. It was simply the truth as I understood it then. When you build a life with someone for nearly half a century, you assume the people you raise together will become the structure that remains when one half of that life disappears. The house changed after he died. Not suddenly, not violently. Just enough to remind me every day that something essential was missing. Mornings were quieter. The hallway clock sounded louder. I noticed how often I reached for things automatically, then stopped halfway, realizing no one else needed them anymore. I told myself this was grief settling in, nothing more. So I leaned into what still felt solid. I leaned into family. I stayed close to Nathan and Lauren, careful not to overwhelm them, careful not to appear like a woman with too much time and nowhere to put it. I offered help instead of asking for company. Help sounded practical. Help sounded useful. Help sounded welcome. I told myself I was contributing, not intruding. I watched their children when they needed an evening out. I arrived early and left before bedtime routines became complicated. I learned their rules and followed them precisely. I folded laundry the way Lauren preferred, towels aligned, socks paired, shirts smoothed flat. I memorized where things went and made sure they returned there. When I paid for groceries or school supplies, I did it quietly, slipping my card forward before anyone could object. I trusted that these small acts were being added up somewhere, that they were understood as love, that my presence brought relief, that my willingness made their lives easier. I trusted that usefulness translated into belonging. Trust comes naturally to women of my generation. We were raised to believe that showing up consistently created security, that love kept its own records, that family noticed who carried the weight, even if they didn't say so out loud. I reshaped my days around their needs. Doctor appointments were moved, haircuts postponed. If they needed flexibility, I provided it. I canceled plans without resentment. I told myself I was lucky to be needed. I told myself this was purpose, that this was what a good mother did when her role shifted. Slowly, without quite realizing it, my own life grew smaller. My calendar emptied of things that belonged only to me. Conversations drifted past me instead of including me. Decisions were shared after they were finalized, spoken casually, as if my input would only slow things down. I learned to wait for pauses before speaking. Sometimes the pauses never came. When loneliness surfaced, I blamed grief. When something stung, I told myself not to be sensitive. When I felt unseen, I reminded myself that older women were meant to fade a little, to make room for younger lives moving faster than their own. I did not question this belief. It had been taught to me early and reinforced often. Be useful. Be agreeable. Be grateful. Faith can be comforting. It can also keep you from asking questions you should ask sooner. I believed that if I stayed generous, if I stayed quiet, if I stayed available, love would meet me where I stood. I believed family was permanent, not conditional. I believed my years of devotion had built something solid beneath my feet. I did not yet understand that some foundations are only valued while they are holding something up, and once the weight shifts, they are no longer noticed at all. The first clear warning arrived disguised as care, wrapped so neatly that I almost felt foolish later for not thanking her more sincerely. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, one of those days when the light fades earlier than it should and the house feels slightly unfinished, as if something important has stepped out and forgotten to return. Lauren stood at the kitchen counter, her phone turned face down beside her mug, her posture relaxed, her voice measured and calm, the way people sound when they believe they are being fair. "We've been talking," she said, offering a careful smile. "We just want holidays to feel simpler." I nodded right away. I did not ask what she meant. I did not pause long enough to listen to the faint tightening in my chest. I said simpler sounded nice. I said I understood. At the time, I imagined fewer dishes, fewer expectations, less rushing children from room to room. I thought she was offering relief. I thought she was being considerate. I did not understand then that simpler meant without me. After that conversation, the changes came quietly, almost politely, the way adjustments do when no one wants to be accused of being unkind. Plans were made before I heard about them. Invitations arrived late, sometimes framed as last-minute openings instead of settled arrangements. Christmas mornings were suddenly too hectic. Easter lunches became, just for the kids this year. Birthdays were combined, shortened, or celebrated on different days. Always explained. Always reasonable. Always delivered with a tone that suggested questions would only complicate things. I noticed that my role had shifted from participant to convenience. I was welcome when I could help, invisible when my presence might slow the rhythm of the day. When I entered a room, Conversations softened or redirected. When I left, they resumed fully effortlessly. No one was openly unkind. That was the most unsettling part. Everything was smooth, efficient, orderly, as if the discomfort were entirely my responsibility. I told myself this was what healthy boundaries looked like. Young families needed space. Good mothers stepped back. Dignity meant adjusting without complaint. So I adjusted. I waited. I accepted the places I was assigned instead of asking where I belonged. I told myself not to take things personally, even when they felt deeply personal. Even the language changed subtly but consistently. We've already decided. It's just easier this way. We'll let you know. Each sentence was small on its own, harmless enough to repeat later without sounding dramatic. Together, they formed a pattern I did not want to name. There was no single moment sharp enough to protest. No sentence cruel enough to confront without sounding unreasonable. Once, when I mentioned a tradition Nathan had loved as a child, something simple and familiar, Lauren tilted her head and said, "That doesn't really work for us anymore." The word us landed differently than it used to. It no longer included me by default. I felt the boundary close without a sound, like a door pulled shut carefully so it wouldn't slam. I began to feel the shift in my body before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. I hesitated before speaking. I shortened my stories. I watched faces for signs that I was lingering too long. I rehearsed comments in my head before offering them. I noticed myself apologizing for things that did not require apology. I had never done that before in my own family, not once in all the years I had been central to it. Still, I ignored the warning. Women like me are trained to doubt ourselves. We smooth discomfort. We excuse exclusion. We tell ourselves not to make trouble. I said I was imagining things. I said love didn't require reassurance. I said this was just a phase, a busy season, nothing more. But something had cracked. Not loudly. Not enough to stop the evening or change the conversation. Just enough to let a cold draft move in and stay. And once that chill settles, it does not leave on its own. It waits patiently, growing stronger, until the day it finally demands to be felt. After that autumn, I no longer needed explanations. My place in the family was no longer something I wondered about late at night. It was something I was being shown patiently through repetition and routine. I had not been pushed out with anger or confrontation. I had been repositioned with politeness, which somehow made it feel more deliberate, more permanent. They stopped asking my opinion first. Then, without ceremony, they stopped asking it at all. Plans were announced instead of discussed. Dates were chosen, menus finalized, trips booked. I would hear about them afterward, often framed as updates rather than invitations. We decided, they would say, already moving on. If I hesitated or asked a question, the conversation flowed around me as if I hadn't spoken. I learned quickly that keeping pace mattered more than being included. I noticed how often I was guided now. Where to sit, where to put my coat, which drawer to use, which cupboard was just for everyday things. These directions were delivered casually, even kindly, but they carried weight. I was no longer someone who belonged instinctively in the space. I was someone being managed, adjusted, accommodated. The house itself felt different to me. I used to move through it freely, opening drawers without thinking, reaching for towels, refilling the kettle, wiping a counter if I saw a spill. Now I paused before touching anything. I waited. I asked. Each pause reminded me that I was no longer part of the machinery of the home. I was a visitor. There was an afternoon, a few weeks before Thanksgiving, when I brought my homemade pie. The same recipe I had baked every holiday since Nathan was small. I rolled the crust carefully, the way my own mother taught me, and wrapped the dish in a clean towel. The smell of cinnamon clung to my coat as I carried it inside, feeling oddly nervous, as if presenting something fragile. I set it on the counter, stepping aside so I wouldn't interrupt the flow of preparation. Lauren glanced at it and said, "We'll save that for later," then slid it to the side to make room for a store-bought dessert already arranged on a board. It had a little label card. Someone took a photo. The pie sat untouched the entire evening. I watched plates being passed around me, conversations skipping easily from one person to the next. Stories overlapped. Jokes landed. I waited for a pause that never quite opened. When I did speak, heads nodded politely, but eyes drifted away before I finished my thought. I felt my sentences shrinking, my voice lowering, as if my body were slowly learning how not to intrude. Even my help had changed. I was no longer asked if I could do something. I was told, "Can you just watch them for a minute? Can you rinse those? Can you move a bit?" Tasks were handed to me efficiently, stripped of warmth or explanation. I completed them quietly, the way I had always completed what was placed in front of me. I did not want to appear difficult. I did not want to confirm any unspoken complaints. I began arriving later and leaving earlier. Not because I had somewhere else to be, but because staying too long made me feel like an obligation that needed managing. The house no longer felt like an extension of my life. It felt like a place I was allowed to visit under certain conditions for a limited time, as long as I didn't disrupt the order. I noticed how carefully I chose my clothes, my words, my timing. I avoided topics that lingered. I laughed when others laughed. I watched the clock without meaning to. I tried to blend into the background, to take up as little space as possible. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself this was respect. But respect, I would come to understand, does not require you to erase yourself. By the time Thanksgiving approached, I already knew something was deeply wrong. I just didn't yet understand how far the distance had already been decided for me, or how quietly I had helped create it by staying silent. And then we arrived at Thanksgiving, the day that had already been rewritten without my input, waiting only to show me how completely I had been moved out of it. I drove over just after noon, hands tight on the steering wheel, the radio turned low. On the passenger seat sat a covered casserole dish and a small tin of cinnamon, because I still believed I should bring something that smelled like care. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Tidy lawns, bare trees, a few porch lights already on though the sun was still up. I parked in the same spot I always had. I even paused as if my body remembered the old rhythm. Walk in, kiss cheeks, hang my coat, step straight into the kitchen. I carried my dish up the steps with both hands, careful, steady, as if steadiness could protect me. When I opened the door, the house was full. Warm air rolled over me, butter, sage, roasting skin, a hint of cranberry. Voices overlapped in the living room. Children ran past my knees with sticky fingers. Coats were already hung in neat rows. Shoes were lined up like a display. I stood in the entryway, my scarf still looped through my fingers, waiting for someone to notice that I had arrived. They did. Just not with the softness I expected. Lauren called out from the kitchen without turning her head. "Hi, Mary. Just put that on the counter." The words were polite, efficient, like instructions to a delivery driver. Nathan appeared for a moment, smiling with his eyes already elsewhere. He gave my shoulder a quick squeeze and said, "Hey, Mom," before drifting back toward the living room, where laughter rose and fell like waves. I set the dish down. I washed my hands. I tried to slip into the familiar tasks, stirring, slicing, setting out serving spoons, until I realized everything had already been arranged. Labels on containers, timers on the oven, Lauren's sister plating appetizers on a board that looked like it belonged in a magazine. There was no empty corner for me to occupy. No gap waiting for my hands. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being silly. I told myself I was grateful they were managing. Still, I felt it, the way you feel a room tighten when your chair scrapes the floor. When dinner was announced, the house shifted in one smooth motion. Chairs scraped back. People claimed places without looking. A child was lifted onto a booster. Someone poured sparkling cider. I followed with my plate, the same plain white plate I had eaten from at that table for years, and I looked for my seat the way a person looks for something they're certain is there. It wasn't. That was when Lauren glanced up and said it, lightly, almost apologetically, as if she were pointing out a minor inconvenience. "There's no seat left. You can sit over there." She gestured toward a small side table near the wall. A folding chair waited beside it. The place setting was already there, napkin, fork, a glass. Separate, angled away from the main table. Prepared in advance, not improvised. Someone had planned my distance. I froze with the plate in my hands. The room kept moving. Someone laughed at a joke I couldn't hear properly. The turkey was being passed. A gravy boat slid along the table like a little ceremony. Glasses were raised. The moment had already moved on without me. And for me, there was no chair at the table. Thanksgiving. My family. My home. I stood there longer than I should have, the porcelain warming my palms. My mouth pulled into the smile women like me learned to wear. Pleasant, practiced, painless. Inside, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind me, steady and indifferent, and I noticed the clock on the microwave blinking 1 minute fast the way it always did. The normal details felt sharper, almost cruel, because everything looked ordinary while something essential was breaking. I wanted to say, "Is this a joke?" I wanted to ask Nathan if he saw it. I wanted anyone to push back a chair and say, "Mom here." But words require permission, and I understood then that I no longer had it. So I walked to the side table. The folding chair creaked as I sat. My knees faced the wall. The main table was behind my shoulder, close enough that I could smell the food, far enough that I was not part of it. I ate quietly, listening to conversation drift around me like smoke. Someone asked for seconds. Someone clinked a glass. No one turned. From the corner of my eye I saw my old seat, where my husband used to sit, filled by a neighbor's boyfriend. He smiled at me kindly, unaware, and then leaned back into the story being told. Now, something broke in me then, cleanly, without drama. Not anger. Not tears. Just a clear, final understanding that settled the way a stone settles to the bottom of water. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't run out of space. They had made a decision. And in that moment I realized I was not being accommodated. I was being erased. The truth did not come to me all at once. It arrived slowly, in the quiet days after Thanksgiving, when the house returned to its familiar stillness and my phone stayed silent on the counter. No one called to ask if I had gotten home safely. No one sent a message to explain what had happened. There was no apology, no discomfort, no attempt to soften the memory. The silence itself became the answer. First I waited. I told myself they were tired, that holidays were overwhelming, that someone would eventually say we should talk. Or, I didn't realize how that looked. I replayed the evening again and again, searching for a detail I might have misunderstood. But days passed, then weeks, and the waiting itself began to feel intentional. That was when I understood the first truth. If it had been a mistake, it would have been named. Accidents bring embarrassment. Oversights bring apologies. What I received instead was distance. Once I stopped defending them in my own mind, memories I had ignored for years began to surface. Small moments rearranged themselves into a pattern I could no longer deny. The way my help was expected without discussion. The way no one asked if I was tired or needed anything in return. The way plans continued smoothly whether I was present or not. I saw clearly how often my absence had made things easier, not harder. Thanksgiving was not the beginning. It was confirmation. The second truth took longer to accept because it challenged something I wanted very much to believe. My presence had become optional long before that dinner. I was not included because I was missed. I was included because it looked appropriate. I was welcome as long as I remained flexible, agreeable, and undemanding. My value had quietly shifted from who I was to what I provided. I thought about the months after my husband died. How my grief had been acknowledged once, then gently set aside, as if it were something already processed. How rarely anyone asked how the nights felt now, or what the silence did to me. I had assumed they were being respectful. I saw now they were being efficient, moving forward without slowing down. The hardest truth came last, and it stayed with me the longest. I had participated in my own erasure, not because I believed I deserved it, and not because I wanted to disappear, but because I had been taught that love meant endurance. I stayed quiet when something hurt. I smiled when I should have paused the moment. I accepted smaller and smaller spaces without asking why they were shrinking. I had taught them, gently and consistently, that I would adapt to whatever was offered, that I would wait, that I would understand, that I would not ask for more. Seeing this did not make me angry. It made me clear in a way that felt steady rather than sharp. I understood then that the chair placed away from the table was not meant to humiliate me. It was meant to define me. It was their way of saying without words, "This is where you fit now." And in that clarity, something inside me finally settled. I understood that knowing the truth did not obligate me to accept it. It only meant I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. And once you truly see something, you cannot live the same way again. I did not confront them that night. I did not push my chair back or ask for an explanation. I did not raise my voice or let my face show what had settled inside me. I finished my food quietly. I folded my napkin the way I always had. I thanked Lauren for dinner. I kissed Nathan's cheek and told him to drive safely when they traveled the next day. Then I went home. That was the moment they misunderstood completely. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They thought my calm meant agreement. They believed, as they always had, that I would absorb the discomfort and carry it alone. But silence can be a decision. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after I had taken my coat off. The house smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and leftover cinnamon from the casserole dish I had brought back untouched. I placed my purse on the chair across from me and emptied it slowly, deliberately. My keys, a folded receipt, my checkbook, a small envelope with documents I had meant to file months ago. I slept very little. In the morning I made tea and opened my laptop. Not with anger, with focus. I looked at things I had avoided looking at before. Bank statements, automatic transfers, the small, regular payments I had set up years ago without thinking twice. School contributions, monthly help, emergency funds I had quietly replenished whenever they were used. I realized how much of my life was still arranged around theirs. I called my bank before noon. My voice was steady. I asked questions. I listened carefully. I made changes. I canceled standing transfers. I moved accounts. I set new boundaries in places that had been left open simply because I had never closed them. It was not dramatic. It was administrative. Over the next week, I did the same with my time. I stopped rearranging my days around their schedules. I did not rush to respond to messages that asked for help without context. I did not volunteer explanations. When asked why something was different, I said only, "I'm simplifying." No one argued with that word. They had taught it to me. I did not announce my decision. I did not threaten consequences. I did not ask to be treated better. I simply removed myself from the role that had made my erasure possible. For the first time in years, my life began to feel aligned with my body. I slept better. I moved more slowly. I noticed things again, the sound of birds in the morning, the way sunlight fell across the kitchen floor, the weight of my own choices settling back into my hands. This was not revenge. It was correction. Sometimes the loudest change is made without witnesses. Sometimes dignity does not require an audience. And sometimes the most powerful boundary is the one you do not explain at all. I had not shouted. I had not demanded. I had simply chosen myself. And that, I would soon learn, was what they never expected. The consequences did not arrive immediately. They never do when people are used to your quiet reliability. At first, nothing seemed different to them at all. Days passed. Then a week. Then another. I did not call. I did not offer help. I did not remind anyone of anything they might be forgetting. I let the space stay empty. It took time for them to notice because my absence did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, in small disruptions they were not prepared for. A school pickup that fell through. A payment that didn't process the way it usually did. A weekend plan that required more coordination than expected. That was when the calls began. Nathan called first. His voice sounded careful, almost puzzled, like someone checking a detail they assumed had already been handled. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. He asked if I had changed something with the bank. I said I had simplified a few things. He paused longer than usual before saying my name. Lauren's message came later. It was polite, neutral. She said she was a bit confused and wanted to make sure there hadn't been a misunderstanding. I read it twice before replying. I told her there hadn't been. I said I was making adjustments that worked better for me now. That was when the tone shifted. There were follow-up calls. Longer ones. Explanations offered that I had not asked for. Apologies that circled carefully around the real issue without landing on it. I listened without interrupting. I did not fill silences. I did not rush to reassure them. They were not upset because they had hurt me. They were unsettled because something they depended on had quietly moved out of place. Logistics failed first. Then expectations. Then comfort. They began to realize how much had been carried without discussion. How many details had been smoothed over before they became problems. How often my presence had prevented inconvenience simply by being constant. For the first time, They were adjusting to a world that no longer arranged itself around them. There were tears eventually. Real ones. Not dramatic but surprised. Nathan asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told him I had been listening instead. Lauren said she never meant for me to feel excluded. I believed her. Intention does not erase outcome. They asked if we could reset. If we could talk about things. If I could help again just a little while they figured things out. That was the moment I understood the full shape of the consequence. They saw me now. Clearly. Fully. But only because something they relied on was gone. I did not punish them. I did not lecture. I did not ask for promises. I simply said I was taking care of myself now, and that my life looked different than it used to. Silence followed that answer. Not the dismissive kind. The reconsidering kind. They were forced for the first time to sit with the discomfort of recognizing someone only after they stopped being convenient. And I let them sit with it. Because growth does not come from being rescued. It comes from being required to notice what was always there. I had not raised my voice. I had not demanded recognition. I had simply stepped out of the role they had built their comfort on. And that quietly changed everything. I did not forgive them. Not in the way forgiveness is usually presented. As something cleansing and generous that restores everything to its former place. I did not forgive them because forgiveness in that moment would have required me to pretend that nothing essential had been lost. And something had been lost. Something quiet but fundamental. I also did not hold on to anger. Anger would have kept me tied to the very space I was learning to leave. What guided me instead was something steadier. Something I had neglected for years without realizing it. Self-respect. For most of my life I had confused endurance with love. I believed that staying, absorbing, adjusting, and waiting were signs of strength. I believed a good mother made herself smaller so others could grow comfortably around her. I believed silence was grace and patience was virtue, even when it came at the cost of my own place in the room. Choosing myself did not look dramatic from the outside. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no final conversation where everything was laid bare. I did not draw lines in the sand or ask for assurances that would only be temporary. I simply stopped returning to spaces where I was asked to sit apart. When invitations came, I paused instead of answering immediately. I asked myself how I felt when I imagined being there. When requests followed, I examined them gently, honestly. Were they rooted in connection or convenience? Were they reaching for me, or for what I provided? If the answer did not sit well in my body, I declined politely. No explanations. No apologies. This was unfamiliar territory. I had spent decades anticipating needs before they were spoken. I had been proud of that skill. Now I practiced listening to my own needs, something that felt awkward at first, like writing with my non-dominant hand. But over time it grew easier. More natural. More truthful. I learned that walking away does not always mean abandoning people. Sometimes it means stepping out of the role they assigned you without asking. Sometimes it means letting relationships reveal their true shape once you stop holding them up. There were moments of doubt. Quiet ones. Evenings when the house felt too still and old habits tugged at me. I wondered if I had been too firm, too distant, too proud. Those thoughts always passed when I remembered the folding chair, the angled table, the certainty I felt in that moment when something inside me finally said, enough. I did not need them to suffer. I did not need apologies to justify my choice. I only needed to live in a way that did not require me to disappear. Choosing myself meant choosing peace over proximity. It meant accepting that love offered without respect is not something to chase or negotiate. It meant understanding that not every relationship can follow you into the next season of your life. I am still a mother. That did not change. What changed was my willingness to accept a version of motherhood that required self-erasure. I choose myself now. Quietly. Fully. Without guilt. And in doing so, I reclaimed the place I had been missing all along. Not at their table, but within my own life. If you are treated like a stranger at your own table, it does not mean you have lost your worth. It does not mean you have failed as a mother, a woman, or a human being. Sometimes it means the room has changed and no one bothered to tell you. For a long time, I believed love required endurance. I believed that staying quiet was kindness, that adjusting was maturity, that patience would eventually be rewarded with care. I see now that love without respect slowly empties a person, even when it looks peaceful from the outside. Walking away was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of honesty. I finally told the truth to myself, and that truth asked me to choose a different way of living. One where I did not have to shrink to be included. One where my presence did not need justification. I have learned that dignity is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply refuses to sit where it is not welcomed. And when you choose yourself with calm clarity, something remarkable happens. You begin to breathe again. If this story touched a nerve, you are not alone. Many of us were taught to give until there was nothing left, and then to smile about it. But silence does not have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning of your strength. If this resonated with you, you belong here. Subscribe to hear more truths like this, stories where silence becomes strength, and choosing yourself becomes the bravest act of all.